Have you ever found yourself in the middle of an argument where you poured your heart into every sentence, where you articulated your beliefs with honesty, defended your point with all the logic and emotion you had, and yet walked away feeling like you lost something? Not because you were wrong, but because deep down, something inside you knew. You gave away your power the moment you started explaining. It's not that your voice was weak, it's that you let someone else set the frame. And once you're caught in someone else's frame, you're no longer speaking from your center, you're reacting. That is the first mark of lost ground in a man's soul.
We live in a world addicted to immediacy. Everyone rushes to speak, to comment, to win, to prove. Silence has become almost suspicious. And because of that, most men were never taught that the need to speak first, to rush into clarification, to defend one's name is not a strength. It's often a symptom of internal fragility. It says, "I cannot bear being misunderstood. I cannot tolerate your disapproval. I need to be seen. I need to be right. I need to be justified." But the man who needs none of those things, that man terrifies people. That man is a mirror, and most cannot bear to see themselves reflected in stillness. Nietzsche understood this. He wasn't writing for those who just wanted to win debates. He was writing for the man at war with his own impulses, the man who has realized that reaction is a form of surrender. He taught us, to speak is not to lead. Sometimes to speak too soon is to reveal that you still depend on the external to validate the internal. True strength is not in how loud you can shout your truth, but in how deeply you can hold it in silence until the world has no choice but to feel it. A real man does not react to every jab. He does not explain his dignity. He does not hand over his calm just because someone else threw chaos into the room. He is not afraid to be misunderstood because he knows that truth does not always travel on the back of words. It is often recognized through silence, through stillness, through unshakable presence. That is the true battlefield Nietzsche spoke of. Not the battlefield of arguments or rhetoric, but the battlefield within the self where your impulse to speak too quickly, to defend too eagerly, is often the exact moment your internal power slips through your fingers. Silence is a presence that unsettles. It disrupts the script. It denies the other person a predictable rhythm. It forces them to face the terrifying reality that they do not know what you're thinking. They do not know what you'll do next. And worst of all, they can no longer control the dynamic. In that space of uncertainty, the balance of power shifts. Because human beings, especially the insecure, are terrified of what they cannot dominate. The less they know, the more they panic. The more they panic, the more they talk. And the more they talk, the more they reveal. Meanwhile, you, the one who chooses to remain silent, become a mirror, exposing the chaos they carry within. There will be times in your life when you encounter people who speak first, always. People who try to overpower you with words. They interrupt, dominate, provoke. But never forget this. The first one to speak is often the one who exposes their hand. The one who reacts is the one who's been moved. The one who explains first is often the one who already feels the ground slipping beneath him. He may appear confident, but his need to lead with words betrays a deeper fear, the fear that without control of the narrative, he ceases to matter. Silence, then, is not an absence. It is not a void. It is a storm contained. It is power held. It is the quiet authority of a man who no longer needs to convince or convert. He stands still, not because he is empty, but because he is full of observation, full of discernment, full of presence. In a world where people are addicted to reaction, a man who can hold his tongue becomes a dangerous anomaly. This is your message, you, the man who is learning how to grow not in spectacle, but in stillness. You don't need to win every argument. You don't need to prove your worth through rebuttals. You just need not lose yourself. And sometimes, your silence, deliberate, anchored, sovereign, will echo louder than any shout in a room full of noise. Nietzsche would have called it the voice of the Übermensch, the one who does not argue to be understood, but who lives in such alignment with truth that explanation becomes unnecessary. Let others throw their words like stones. Let them shout, let them posture, but you learn to carry your stillness like a blade. Because in the end, the man who controls his voice is the man who controls the room. Train yourself in the discipline of silent patience. Learn to let others draw the wrong conclusions about you and smile. Not because you're passive, but because you understand that what they're reacting to isn't you, it's their own projection. And once you no longer need to defend yourself, you're no longer prey in a psychological game. You become the one holding the board. Prepare yourself to see silence through an entirely new lens. Not as the absence of a response, but as the ultimate answer. We're about to walk into Nietzsche's philosophy, not to learn how to win arguments with sharper words, but how to master every room without needing to speak at all. Why do we feel such an urge to react, to explain, to correct, to prove we're right? Because deep within us lies a belief that was installed long ago, that truth must be protected at all costs, that if we remain silent, it means we've lost. But Nietzsche, the one who saw straight through the mask of civilization, realized something much darker. This compulsion to defend truth often hides a far deeper weakness, the fear of being perceived as weak. And behind that fear is the ego fragile, insecure, and unable to bear being misunderstood. An ego that confuses disagreement with attack. One that turns every conversation into a battlefield, not in search of truth, but to preserve the illusion of self. Nietzsche once said, "Most people do not seek truth in an argument. They seek power." They debate, not because their beliefs are strong, but precisely because they're weak. If not constantly reinforced, their convictions would collapse. So the argument becomes armor, not philosophy, but a panic response. Not wisdom, but desperation for control. And the moment you feel you must explain, justify, or correct, you've already stepped into their frame and lost. Because the mere need to be understood, the craving for validation, the desperation to clear things up, all of it reveals that you are still tethered to approval. You are still trying to be accepted. You are still not free. Nietzsche called this herd morality, the psychology of those who live according to how they are perceived. Those who crave to be seen as righteous, moral, agreeable without realizing that this craving is the very chain that binds their strength. As long as you seek agreement, you are still weak. True strength, according to Nietzsche, is not found in convincing others, but in no longer needing to. It is the power to hold your truth without applause, to stand alone without collapsing, to be misunderstood, yet unmoved, to sit in a room full of those who've lost control while you remain unshaken, like a mountain. So if you truly want to win, not in the eyes of others, but in the arena of your own life, you must understand this. The first to speak is the first to reveal his weakness. The one who breaks the silence first, who rushes to prove himself, is already on the defensive. He has surrendered the weight of his presence in exchange for the volatility of reaction. Debate, Nietzsche reminds us, is just a stage, and the first actor to step into the light, to speak too soon, has already exposed himself to judgment. Because, in truth, the mind that reacts has already been conquered, but the mind that observes sharp, still, and detached is what unnerves the world. It doesn't need to speak. It doesn't seek to persuade. It sees, and by seeing clearly, it surpasses the game itself. But then the question arises, if I'm not supposed to react, how do I express my strength? If words betray me, if speaking means surrendering ground, how will others know who I truly am? How will they feel my presence if I don't assert it? Nietzsche would tell you, true presence is not asserted, it is emanated. The strongest men do not announce themselves. They do not demand to be seen. They do not seek to be understood. They carry their truth like a blade tucked into silence, and that silence speaks volumes. That's why their absence commands attention. Why their restraint commands respect. Because strength that doesn't crave recognition is the most intimidating force in any room. Nietzsche answered that very question with the image of the Übermensch, the overman, the one who transcends conventional morality and conquers life through absolute self-mastery. And, in the next stage of our journey, we step deeper into this figure to understand why silence is not withdrawal, but a strategic weapon of supreme power. Are you ready to go that deep? Because from this point forward, silence begins to speak. And if what you've heard so far resonates, then continue, because this path is not for the masses. It is for the rare few, who dare to stare directly into the abyss of their own psyche and forge their pain into power. Nietzsche never wrote for the weak. He wrote for the solitary souls, the ones who have no need for applause, no hunger for approval, only the relentless pursuit of truth. To Nietzsche, the ordinary man lives shackled by morality, by collective beliefs, by the applause of the crowd. He lives to be right, to be understood, to be accepted. His life is a negotiation with the world, always reacting, always adjusting, always seeking permission to exist. But there exists another kind of man, rare, dangerous, radically free, the Übermensch. This man does not live in reaction to the world. He reshapes the world in the image of his own inner order. His compass is not consensus, but conviction. His power does not lie in making noise. It lies in how much noise he no longer needs to make. And here lies the most paradoxical truth. The greatest transformations are not announced. They occur in silence. The Übermensch does not waste energy explaining himself. He does not seek to win arguments, to justify his boundaries, to beg for understanding. His very presence rooted in silence, carved in solitude, becomes an undeniable force. A man like this doesn't need to demand respect. The world adjusts to him, or collapses trying to resist him. So now the question returns to you not as a theory, but as a mirror. Will you keep shouting to be heard in a deaf world? Or will you begin to build your presence in the quiet furnace of your own becoming? Because if you are to become anything more than what the world expects of you, you must learn this ancient truth. Silence is the native language of the powerful. And the moment you embrace it, not out of fear, but from clarity, you will no longer just participate in the world. You will begin to shape it. The Übermensch does not need to win arguments. He does not engage in petty emotional theatrics. He watches, he listens, he analyzes. And then, when the time is right, he chooses to speak, or chooses to remain silent, with the precision of a final sword strike delivered by a master. Because he understands something the average man never sees. Silence is a language that does not seek to persuade, but commands respect. A language that does not negotiate, but imposes presence. The silence of the Übermensch is not an absence, it is a force, a metaphysical field, a gravitational pull that alters the emotional temperature of the entire space. When a man sits still, unreactive, unprovoked, unhurried in defense, he is not weak. He has elevated himself above the battlefield. While others are throwing verbal punches, scrambling to be right, raising their voices to dominate the air, the silent man becomes a stone wall in a storm, unshaken, unmoved, and utterly unfazed. He becomes a presence without a name, but one that everyone in the room feels in their bones. You think you need to speak to prove yourself. You think silence is surrender. You were taught this as a child. Speak up, explain, react, defend. But all of that is the reflex of a fragile ego, afraid of being misunderstood, afraid of being judged, afraid of being excluded. That is not power. That is noise. Real power, the kind Nietzsche described, begins where noise ends. The man who chooses silence not out of fear, but from discernment, becomes dangerous in the most beautiful way. He is no longer pulled into the theater of emotional reactivity. He becomes the one no one can provoke, not because he lacks emotion, but because he has mastered it. And that mastery, that self-possession, is what makes him unforgettable. He doesn't dominate the room by speaking louder. He dominates it by embodying gravity, the kind that bends the space around him without raising a single word. This is not repression. It is elevation. This is not cowardice. It is sovereignty. And it is from this place of inner stillness that the true Übermensch begins to move not in haste, not in panic, but in total command of self. Nietzsche did not write for the fearful. He wrote for those who have already walked through the fire of fear and emerged on the other side not unburned, but unafraid. For Nietzsche, the one who transcends the Übermensch does not win with words. He conquers with the field of force that radiates from his very being. He does not raise his voice. He does not argue. He silences others with nothing more than a look, and not because his gaze is menacing, but because it is empty of need, empty of the hunger to prove, to persuade, to perform. And when a man no longer needs to prove himself, he becomes untouchable. You see, when you remain silent, you force others to speak. And the more they speak, the more they reveal. The more they try to convince, the more they expose their insecurity. The more they rush to react, the more they betray their own fragility. Silence is not just a strategy, it is a statement, a declaration that says, I do not need your agreement. I do not need your understanding. I am here because I have understood myself. That is a kind of power that no one knows how to oppose. You can challenge a flawed argument. You can dismantle a lie. But you can do nothing against a man who does not speak, who does not flinch, who does not enter your frame. He becomes a mirror, one that reflects your own desperation back at you. The silence of the Übermensch is not passive. It is a black light. It doesn't emit fire, but it burns through every illusion it touches. It strips the pretense from the room. It disarms ego not by attacking it, but by refusing to dance with it. This is the power of the man who has mastered himself. In a world that worships expression, validation, and the loudest opinion, the man who chooses stillness becomes almost supernatural. His silence is not absence, it is dominance. His lack of reaction is not retreat, it is reign. Remember this, the one who speaks first in an argument is usually the one most afraid of silence. Because silence is unbearable for those who fear being seen for who they truly are. Words become their shield, their smokescreen not for clarity, but for concealment. Meanwhile, the man who holds silence is the one who has already risen above the game. He doesn't play to win. He becomes the new rules of the game. Silence is not the absence of sound. Silence is a mirror. And when that mirror is held up to someone else, it does not reflect your face. It reflects everything they are trying to escape within themselves. That is where panic begins. Have you ever tried to remain truly silent in the face of confrontation? No reaction. No justification, no resistance, just presence steady, still, without contempt, without warmth, just there. When you do this, something strange begins to happen. The other person starts to unravel. Why? Because most people don't speak to communicate truth. They speak to defend identity. They speak to construct a fog not just to obscure your perception, but to comfort their own, to whisper to themselves, I'm right. I'm still in control. But when you give them no response to hold on to, they lose their grip. The scaffolding of control begins to crumble. And it is not because you hurt them. It is because your silence exposed what their words were always trying to hide. Their fear. This is where silence becomes terrifying not for you, but for the world around you. Because when you cease to react, you force others to confront the parts of themselves they've kept in the dark. And very few are prepared for that confrontation. Modern psychology confirms what Nietzsche intuitively understood. When confronted with silence during conflict or debate, the human brain enters a state of alarm. The amygdala, the region responsible for processing fear and anxiety, kicks into overdrive. Your opponent, unable to tolerate the absence of feedback, begins to project. Their mind races. What is he thinking? Does he think I'm stupid? Did I just reveal my weakness? Is he judging me? Is he above me? They begin to hallucinate your reaction, painting it with the very brushstrokes of their own fear, insecurity, and shame, all without you saying a word. And this spiral is beyond their control. Your silence, stripped of reaction, stripped of contempt, stripped of the need to be seen, becomes the sharpest blade. It cuts not through flesh, but through the fragile mask of their ego. Because they are no longer confronting you, they are confronting themselves. Do you see the irony now? They told you that silence was weakness, a coward's escape, a refusal to confront. But true silence is the most brutal confrontation of all, because it is not reactive. It is not playing by their rules. It is the refusal to step onto the battlefield they've designed. And when you stop playing the game, they lose the frame, they lose the rhythm, they lose their control. And here lies the terrifying truth. Silence is not absence. Silence is a mirror, and most people were never taught how to look at themselves without distortion. So when you go still, when you retreat into calm, when you refuse to respond, you force them into an arena they have avoided their entire lives, the arena of their unfiltered self. The silent man does not remain silent because he lacks words. He is silent because he has seen the entire theater and refuses to act in a play he no longer believes in. That is power. That is the quiet gaze of a man who has stepped out of the labyrinth, not because he was forced, but because he finally realized it was a game designed to keep him reactive, exposed, and predictable. Understand this. Every reaction reveals something about you. When you get angry, they see where you still bleed. When you rush to defend yourself, they know where you still doubt your own truth. But when you go still, not from fear, but from awareness, you become unreadable. And what cannot be read cannot be controlled. People fear most what they cannot define. They fear your silence, because in that silence, they are left alone with their own echoes. No reassurance, no target, no resistance. Just the raw noise of their own unresolved selves bouncing around the void you refuse to fill. Silence slices into places no one can see, but everyone feels. Nietzsche sensed this long before modern psychology ever measured it. He understood that the average man lives enslaved to his reflexes. He reacts out of fear of being forgotten. He speaks not from clarity, but from a fragile ego that cannot withstand the weight of not being understood. But the man who has transcended himself, the one who has stared into the abyss of his own mind and remained whole, chooses silence not from weakness, but from supreme mastery. He knows. Every word is a chess piece revealed. Every burst of emotion is a flare exposing his position. So he speaks little, and when he does, it lands like thunder. And here is the deeper truth. Silence destroys manipulators. People who live by controlling others' emotional rhythms cannot survive the absence of your reaction. Their power depends on your response, your anger, your need to explain, your desire to be liked. When you give them none of that, the game breaks. And when the game breaks, so do they. But there is a deeper layer, still a truth few dare to face. Silence does more than confuse or disarm. It awakens wounds that were never healed. It echoes the primal fear of abandonment. The invisible child, ignored, dismissed, unseen. When you do not respond, when you do not engage, when you hold still in the storm, the other is forced to confront something terrifying. They are no longer the center. Their words no longer move the air. Their presence no longer dictates the rhythm. Their voice no longer echoes in your emotional chamber. And to the ego, the childish, self-centered ego, this is unbearable. That ego has grown fat, off control, off attention, off the illusion of being the axis upon which others revolve. And when you remove your reaction, you pull the ground out from beneath that illusion. They are no longer powerful because they were never powerful. They were simply enabled by your participation. This is why silence is a direct strike. Not a defense, but an offense launched with precision at the softest spot. Their false sense of power. You don't shout. You don't fight. You don't explain. And in doing nothing, you do everything. Because in that stillness, they realize they can no longer pull your strings. But here's the truth. Most men are afraid to admit silence requires real strength. Not just strength against others. Strength against yourself. Because everything you were taught tells you to speak. You were taught to defend your character, to prove you're the good man, to explain your intentions, to be seen, to be understood, to be liked. You were taught to react. But Nietzsche teaches you something radical, something dangerous, something liberating. He teaches you to stand still, not to submit, but to transcend, to walk away from the noise, and in that walk, to win. And this is precisely why silence is the weapon of those who have transcended the ego. Because only a man who has conquered himself can withstand the void that comes with conscious silence. Only he can endure the burn of being misunderstood and yet feel no need to explain. Only he can be accused and still not defend. Only he can remain still in the face of injustice, not because he's weak, but because he no longer needs to win with words. That is real power. Not the power to dominate others, but the power of self-mastery so deep, so immovable, that no one can reach it. It is the power of a man who no longer plays the game, It is the power of the man who has stepped outside the maze and now watches it burn, not with contempt, not with glee, but with the calm of one who simply no longer needs it. You must remember this. Every reaction gives something away. When you get angry, they find your wound. When you rush to defend, they find your doubt. When you explain too much, they find your dependency. But when you fall silent, not from fear, but from understanding, you become unreadable, untouchable, unshakable. And people fear what they cannot read. They panic in the presence of what they cannot predict. Your silence becomes a mirror, not of yourself, but of them. It forces them to confront the echoes of their own chaos, their own shadows, their own illusions. And that's when the real unraveling begins. Nietzsche understood this long before modern psychology gave it language. He knew that most people aren't reacting to truth, they're reacting to the fear of losing control, the fear of not being seen, the fear of being nobody. And every time you don't react, every time you don't engage, you break their entire psychological script. This is not retreat. This is dominance of the highest order. This is the man who no longer needs to raise his voice because his presence already shifts the room. The manipulator begins to sweat. They can't bait you anymore. They can't guilt trip you. They can't gaslight you because you no longer give them emotional data to feed off. They need you to get angry. They need you to protest. They need you to explain yourself so they can spin the story. But when you go still, the story dies. And they're left alone with the truth they've always run from. They never had power. They only had your reactions. This is why silence demands strength. Not strength over others, strength over yourself. Because silence goes against everything you were taught. You were raised to explain, to defend, to please, to prove your goodness. You were trained to speak. But Nietzsche trains you to stand still. And when you learn to stand still, to say nothing, to withhold your energy, you're not avoiding the battle. You become the battlefield. Not as the one shouting, but as the one who no longer needs the war. This is the essence of Nietzsche's Übermensch. Not a man who dominates through noise, but one who commands through silent force. The man who has nothing left to prove is the man no one can defeat. So, now that you understand what silence truly does, now that you've seen how it disarms, exposes, and dissolves illusion, it's time to go further. It's time to become not just the observer of this power, but its master. In the next chapter, you'll learn how to turn your silence into a strategic weapon, a precise, surgical force. Not a shield of withdrawal, but a sword of clarity. A blade so sharp, so unexpected, that it cuts through the lies, the manipulation, the noise without ever having to be raised. Stay with me. What comes next is not for the average man. But if you've made it this far, something in you is ready to rise. The first step, deceptively simple, yet brutally transformative, is this. Hold your silence precisely when every inch of your ego is screaming to react. It's not easy, because everything inside you will burn to speak. You'll crave to defend yourself. You'll want to prove that you're right. You'll ache to take back the upper hand to reclaim your worth in the eyes of others. But that craving, that impulse to speak, to be understood, to control the narrative, that's the true toxin. Every time you give in, every time you speak from that place, you're confessing something deeper, that you're still being controlled. Not by others, but by your own need to be seen, to be affirmed, to be right. You're still dancing on a stage built by someone else. Real silence, the kind that holds power, is born only when you destroy that need. When you finally see that you don't owe anyone an explanation. When you grasp the terrifying freedom in the realization that truth exists even when unsaid. That reality doesn't require an audience to be real. That your strength doesn't depend on being recognized, it depends on being unshakable. And from that moment, you enter the second form of silence, not retreat, but reconnaissance. While others talk endlessly, spinning justifications, hiding fear behind words, masking confusion with conviction, you remain still, but not still. like a victim. Still like a hunter. Still like a mountain. You listen but not with ears. You listen with instinct.